Hi, so welcome to another episode of Opinionate. I'm here today with Patricia, an avid reader of feminist theory, especially Judith Butler. So welcome, Patricia. Patricia, I'm sorry.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about gender and gender abolition, and its difference with sort of like race and race abolition. So I'm gonna start by, asking Patricia to sort of like tell us more about what gender is. There are there's a lot of debate like around what gender means. Can you tell us a little bit about like how sort of different scholars define gender?
Yeah, okay. So, fun fact, like before this, like me and Henry or Henry and I were like talking a little bit on video call, and then I said like maybe one of the most ubiquitous ideals of gender itself is just that idea of its imposition on a person. Like Judith Butler said, gender is like a repeated stylization of the body. It's kind of like an ideal or an imposition on a person, and then it reflects how they act and how they kind of like live their life through too. So like gender in this case would be like an ideal of what I act towards and like a sort of heuristic of what I am.
Right. So so um so well, I know that Sally Haslanger he defined gender as solely a power relation between the oppressor and the oppressed. So in that case, whoever the oppressor is would be the man. Whoever the oppressed is would be the woman.
Oops.
What do you think about that definition? Hello. If you're speaking, I can't hear you. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Oh,
Did
so
you like
yeah, I asked the question. So I said,
guys?
so I know that Sally Haslinger defines gender solely as a power relation between the oppressor and the oppressed. So she thinks that whoever is the oppressor is the man, whoever is the oppressed is the woman.
hmm
What do you think about that definition?
Um, Wait, pardon, can you repeat that? Like my Wi-Fi is really weird.
Oh, okay. So Sally Haslinger defines gender as simply a power relation between the oppressor and the oppressed. So she thinks that whoever is the
hmm
oppressor is the man, whoever is the oppressed is the woman. So what do you think about this definition?
Okay, so I think that has some really interesting implications. I think that a lot of people argue that something like the patriarchy is very innate and it's inevitable. Like the idea that there's gonna be a man and a woman is such it's like an innate thing that's always gonna happen. I do agree that like the idea of the oppressor and the oppressed, there's always gonna be a label towards each of them, and then obviously saying the words like oh the patriarchy has been seen in such like a pejorative manner, but yeah, I do agree with her in the way that there always will like there is an oppressor and an oppressed, but I disagree with the fact that it's inevitable. I think that equality and like for example equity is something that could be reached. Yeah, that's basically it, but I would agree with her in that there are like labels for oppressor and oppressed. I don't know if they always necessarily have to stick with like men and women though. I think that's just like something that depends because like you mentioned there are different things that someone can be oppressed on like race or whatever.
Right. Right. So do you think that, as oppression is sort of inevitable or inherent in sort of like labeling people with gender?
um Yeah, I think that as long as there is an idea of a man and a woman, and there's ideas of masculinity and femininity, the idea that, like, for example, femininity is so much like insuperior to masculinity, that would create a sort of like power divide, obviously, and that would lead to oppression.
Okay, very interesting. So, okay, can you tell us a little bit about um, the arguments for gender abolition?
Yeah, okay. So gender abolition is the ideal that, like, we should reach a world in which gender is not a thing anymore, and which the ideal of gender isn't a thing anymore. And by doing this, we achieve a sort of equality around gender. So I think because gender is such like it's more abstract than something like race, right? If we were calling for like race abolition, it's something entirely different from gender abolition, because gender is something more abstract, and because it's less concrete, we can kind of break it down into its ways more. And by like the arguments for gender abolition would be like, we like instill the right to equality by gender abolition, because without the ideals of gender and gender roles, and more like a place of equality can be better reached.
So, how how are we gonna do that? What are the sort of theories?
Okay, so I think one of the leading theories that, like, especially Judith Butler loves to talk about is the fact that first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that we have gender roles, and that these gender roles are like a really bad thing, because the idea of gender abolition is something that's like so that seems so far fetched. Gender is so integrated in our lives, and like medicine, in politics, and everywhere. They're so set in our societal norm that, and imagining a society without gender seems like impossible. So that's why I believe like the first few steps should be acknowledging the fact that there are gender roles, and these gender roles have led to things like, if I'm a woman, I feel like a loser if I don't shave or something, or like I feel like if I have a daughter, I had to teach her to play with Barbies instead of playing with like trucks and toy cars or whatever. The idea of gender abolition should start first and foremost with acknowledging that these kinds of like gender norms exist in our society, and these are causing men and women to feel sort of oppressed in their own society roles, because they feel like they need to live up to a standard of acting like a man or being like a woman.
Right. So, what about bathrooms? Like after we abolish gender, like what happens to these bathrooms? Like, how do people go to bathrooms? Like, isn't that gonna cause like a lot of like problems?
Yeah,
Like,
okay, something that's super interesting. Yeah, so something that's super interesting um here, like in Toronto, is I went to the like the art gallery of Ontario, and then I tried to go to the washroom, and I was with my mom, right? And then the thing about these washrooms is that they don't have signs on them. They believe in like gender neutral washrooms. So my mom was so confused. She walked into one bathroom and there were urinals, and she was like, "What the hell is going on?" Because there were no signs. So she was like flabbergasted. And um even though this, and like basically I stood outside the washroom, and then I watched as like people, because I was waiting for my mom, I was watching as people like walk back and forth through these washrooms, and they were also confused. And then at one point I had to point out to them like, yeah, that one's the one with the urinals, that one's the one without the urinals. And I think that this idea of like washrooms in the future of gender abolition is kind of like that, because it's already being implemented in place. The problem lies mostly with people that like are so used to the idea of a female washroom and like and a male washroom, that they'll like definitely really get confused with this. But I think if we implemented something in the long term, it'll be more like ubiquitous, especially seeing as it's already like a thing now. And gender, like I have a gender neutral washroom at my school. These things are becoming more and more common, and the more and more we implement them, we can like kind of expose them to society as if like in the future.
right, but isn't there gonna be like sort of larger problems of sexual assault if we have like so gender neutral or genderless bathrooms?
Yeah, like the worry here is that like if I guess like the worry, I think the thing here is that in the future, without like the ideals of gender, sexual assault as a thing would be kind of like would be dealt in with a different way, because without an idea of gender, the biological terms of like men and women would be inherently different. And sexual assault's already something that happens so much because it's already like rape culture is instilled so much into patriarchy, and the idea that like men are like all powerful and they should like do whatever they want because they have this like sense of power. But once that is like abolished, I believe that like the ideals of like sexual assault in washrooms would be like significantly less, because the ideal of like men in powers would be like decreased too. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, because I think like patriarchy does provide sort of justification sometimes for somebody to
Mm-hmm.
for a man to rape a woman. So
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, so what's your ideal bathroom policy? Like, do you think we should sort of like categorize bathrooms by um, sexual orientation, or should we just like make it genderless or something else?
At the moment, I believe that we need to have gender neutral washrooms first and foremost, because like there are a lot of like trans people or non-binary people that might feel like uncomfortable by like sticking to one type of washroom. However, in the future, I do believe we should have gender neutral washrooms if we're going with gender abolitionism. They'll just be a washroom. It won't be like labeled as what type of washroom. Just like in back in the day, there were segregated washrooms, right? There were like washrooms for people of color and washrooms for like people that weren't people of color. And I hope in the future we'll like have to take down the labelings of like male washroom and female washroom.
Right. But okay, yeah. So yeah, speaking of trans people, is gender abolition
Mm-hmm.
going to like infringe on their identity? Um, so
Yeah, that's such
yeah.
like an interesting argument. Yeah. No, I understand where you're coming from. That is such an interesting argument, because like before, when I was researching gender abolitionism, um there was an argument that like gender abolitionism is going to cause the genocide of trans people. And then like I thought that was really interesting, because I definitely don't know how I would agree with it. I think especially like Judith Butler says, like for example, drag is like, why is my phone ringing? Okay. Like drag is like a performance to people, and gender is also sort of like a performance. I believe that without the ideals of gender, people can just express themselves the way they want to be. Rather
Uh,
than, I don't think it would, because the idea of gender doesn't exist. The idea of like a man wanting a woman or a woman wanting a man won't necessarily. Oh, okay, sorry.
sorry, like I didn't hear you like since Judith Butler. Like you said,
Wait,
Judith
can you hear
Butler
me
said
now?
something. Sort of.
Wait,
And
okay, wait, is it better now?
hello, hello. Yeah, excuse us. So, well, I guess the questions right now is to think about, what gender abolition entails for trans people. Um, what is sort of the trans experience? And
Okay, hi, I'm back.
Right.
Sorry, I think
Can you hear me?
something happened. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, wait, are you muted? No, you're
No.
not muted.
Okay,
But I
am I
can hear
good
you
now?
though.
You can't or you can?
Yeah, I can see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Is my typer was okay, I'm back.
Hello?
I'm back. Can you hear me now or am I still
I
like
still can't
bad?
hear you. Uh, are you sure you're not muted? Or you're using the right microphone? That's really weird. I'll quit. I'll rejoin. Uh,
I'm so pretty.
hello?
Hi. Can you hear me now?
I still can't hear you. That's really weird.
God. Um, oops.
Mm, okay.
Wait,
Uh,
can you hear me? Or
I still can't hear you. I don't know what you're saying.
okay, 1 second.
Oh, you're here. Cannot hear you. Why? Could be my problem. Still can't hear you. Um, why? Okay, well, okay. Do you mind if we? I don't know. This is so complicated. What do you think, Astrid? Oh, okay. That'd be really good if you can do that. No, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Wait, can you hear me? Girl, wait, Henry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't hear you. Uh,
Mhm.
oh wait, you can wait. That's really weird. I'll rejoin. Oh wait, I can hear you right now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I could.
Wait, you can hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry,
Okay.
this is so
No,
complicated.
I think that might be my bad. Something with the speaker, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so we were speaking about bathrooms and like I just thought that like but sort of by asking the question like about infringing trans people's right, we're sort of like we're sort of like not being trans blind because this is gonna infringe on everyone's racial I mean gender identity, right? It's not just like it's gonna infringe on trans people's gender identity. It's also gonna infringe on like my gender identity, like if I'm not trans. Um, so well, let me ask you about sort of what you think about the ethics of revolution. You know, in a sort of a normal like conception of revolution, like some a group of people do something without the consent of some other group of people to achieve some purpose of like reform, but that's going to cause some people to sort of be injured or some people to die. So, what do you think about the ethics of revolution? When is a revolution sort of justified, and if it ever is? Wait, hello? Oh, okay. Uh, my bad. Hello? What? I cannot hear you anymore.
Wait, does this work?
Oh yeah, this works.
Okay, great. I don't know what's
Great.
going on.
Okay, so um, right. So I think by asking the question, I was not being like blind to trans people. Like you heard that part, right?
Mhm.
Whatever. So I think like by asking the question like how sort of gender abolition is going to infringe on trans people's rights, we are. I mean, I was not being trans blind because yeah, abolition is going to infringe on everyone's identity regardless of whether you're trans, right?
That's true. So the argument here is that saying that there is no gender in the first place would kind of like infringe on, like, for example, if I think I'm a woman, it would kind of infringe on that part of my identity, right?
Right.
Okay. Um, I think that's a fair argument to make, honestly, especially if gender is so like inherent to who you believe your identity is. However, I think the argument in my perspective is that like by arguing the deconstructionism of gender itself, we sort of argue towards like a greater good of something, and that like it technically wouldn't, like, in an ideal world where gender isn't a thing anymore, you could still express yourself in a certain way. We can like when you're expressing yourself as a woman, there'd be like certain attributes or traits or something. You could still express yourself in a certain way. There just wouldn't be a label to it like a man or a woman. It would just be like a personal preference of what you want to do, I guess. And there wouldn't be any like, because the problem with like gender as itself is that there's a pejorative. There's a pejorative in being a woman because people will always assume things like you're weak or something really stupid, or like you cook a lot, something really dumb. But like the idea of gender abolition is that we can like say that these things don't exist anymore. These kind of like stereotypes don't exist anymore. And from that, you could build your own identity from ground up using whatever you want.
So, what do you think will be the real life implications of gender abolition? For example, on like on fashion, on clothing, on these sort of traditionally um, gender sort of differentiated things.
Yeah. So the thing is that in our modern, very capitalistic society, a lot of these things are already like very skewed. For example, you're talking about fashion in the fashion industry. For the sizing scale for women is so drastically different for the one for men in the terms of that like a woman's small varies greatly from store to store, and that makes it really hard to shop as a woman compared to like, and men also have their different kinds of like issues as well, or like so I think that like in a consumerist mindset, without that ideal of gender, could still be you could still be able to buy certain products. I would argue that it would honestly be a little bit easier because for fashion and these things and stuff, these things would be androgynous. You could still express how you want to dress by buying the clothes you want to buy, but it would be a lot easier in the fact that like you could just like buy pants or whatever using how like men traditionally, like at least in Toronto or like Canada, men buy like their pants using like their inseam sizes or whatever. We could like apply that to everyone. They could just buy their jeans by like how long their legs are or something. It doesn't have to be something really complicated as women's fashion is now. I would argue that it's going to be like a better thing with gender abolitionism.
Hmm. So, do you think fashion now is sort of infiltrated with oppression? Like, is a
Definitely.
woman's clothing sort of like a product of gender oppression, like their style and stuff, I guess.
Definitely. With everything that like with all the commodities we buy, a lot of it deals with the fact that specifically these corporations want to make money. So they'll find whatever it is. Like shaving wasn't a tradition for women until razor companies decided they weren't making enough sales. So they got to start doing something. So they start shaming women for not shaving to start making them buy more products. That also goes to fashion too. Like women's pockets, we barely have any pockets in our pants and dresses until very recently. Then I started noticing that stores actually put pockets on like women's things. But like because we didn't have pockets, we had to go out and we also had to buy a purse and things like that. So I think that a lot of the commodities that women have to buy are specifically designed so that like they would so that it's tougher for us or whatever compared to like I don't know for men example.
Hmm. So, okay. Now, what do you think about the ethics of revolution? Because I mean, gender abolition is in some sense a revolution because the end here is some type of reform, and the means here necessarily will involve the infringement of some people's identity without their prior consent, as with other revolutions in history. So, what do you think? when is revolution justified, if ever?
Honestly, I haven't really thought about revolutionary politics as a whole. I will say though that with something as abstract as gender abolition, it's really more something that we have to build towards. Because if we start abolishing gender right now, there's going to be like a full out war or something. Like, not everyone's going to be open to the idea of it. So that's why we have to start building more notices of things that like what is like the ideal of gender norms and what have they done for us. Because like with the topic of revolution, I know that people like Marx and Engels have talked about it a lot, and I do think that it is a really important thing if need be. Um, like for example, that like the revolution against like capitalism is something very different from gender abolition in that it's like more like radical, and it's something that's like that will be born just because of the constant oppression of like the lower class people and like the classism. For gender abolition, I think that there first of all needs to be a wider spread knowledge on what it is specifically first, because the there's such like a negative view of being labeled as like a feminist. Like if you go out and be like, oh, I'm such a feminist, people look at you like, what? Like there's like saying you're a feminist isn't looked upon in the right way. So we gotta like first acknowledge like the difficulties of gender norms, and from there we can like acknowledge gender abolitionism. I'm honestly like open to hearing any of your ideas for revolution because I specifically don't know a lot about that topic.
Well, I'm not sure either. I just thought of the question.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, for sure.
I mean, like, I feel like this sort of goes into rational expectation in society. Like, I mean, it's okay to drive a car, right? It's okay to drive a car, even though some people, even though it is going to more likely harm somebody compared to walking, I guess. Or if you want to go somewhere, driving a car is more dangerous for others than if you walk. But it's still okay because society just consents. So there's this sort of like um, societal contract right here, like about what things you can do, what things you cannot do. And I think that is sort of like the nature of ethics. I think it's just contracts. So I feel like if most people think that if society thinks that revolution is okay, in this case, I mean not in this case, but well, yeah, revolution. If revolution is okay in this case, revolution's okay. But if you're to ask me to like normatively assess, to put forth a theory that like sort of like targets a new situation, I don't think I can do that right away. Uh, yeah, so I think like whatever society thinks is okay, honestly. So I think revolution's probably okay because given how past revolutions work, um, yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I really liked your metaphor with like the car thing. I think it's like telling.
right. So, yeah, is it possible for you to like sort of connect gender abolition with sort of like some theories? Because like I heard you say like deconstruction, so I thought of Derrida. Like, is there any possible connection between the two?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
can you tell us
Derrida
about it?
has like the concept of deconstructionism. Yeah, yeah. I honestly I need to read more Derrida because I'm like a very beginner in Derrida in of itself. But I found his like theories of deconstructionism really interesting pertaining to feminism. He has this idea called mise en abîme, which translates from French to placement into the abyss. And then his idea is that like the more we try to represent ourselves, like the least fully represented we are, because we place like all of our like expectations into this abyss or of some sorts, and by acknowledging how much effort we place into this abyss, we can only acknowledge how like fruitless these attempts have been. So like there's like a feminist writer that Diane Elam, I believe is her last name. I know his first name is Elam, and she like twisted the idea of mise en abîme into miss on a beam for a feminist term. And then basically her idea like pertaining to feminism is that like by saying by calling like some issues women's issues or like feminist issues, we place this idea that there is such a thing as like being a good feminist versus being a bad feminist, and then the good feminist is always someone that's going to look for like the woman's issues or whatever. And then with the mise en abîme, she's basically saying that like for like feminism as a cause, we always like the more we try to fight for feminism, the more we recognize our failures in feminism because we're placing these things into a sort of abyss of sorts, and we're looking at our own failures inside the abyss. It kind of reminds me of that thing Nietzsche said that was like, you stare into the abyss and it stares back at you, even though Nietzsche's is more like depressing, but this is also fairly depressing.
So can you explain to us a little bit like more about what deconstruction is?
Yeah. So honestly, from my interpretation of it, Derrida's deconstructionism has very much to do so as like of the binary components of our language, and he argues that like a word at one specific time in our language can vary greatly from what we like mean at another specific time in language, because words obviously can take on different meaning. And like for example, the words feminist, right? You can say like I'm a feminist to a group of people, and they'll look at you like you're so brave, and you can say I'm a feminist to a group of like people, and they'll look at you like, ew, I hate feminists. But like more of that in a broader sense, it's like words can take on different like meanings if you use them in different ways, and throughout different times and century they can mean different things. Like this is a really embarrassing example, but like my friend, when we were talking about deconstructionism, once told me like the word bad, right? You can say like, oh, like that person is so bad, and then bad would mean like they're so attractive, but obviously bad means another thing, and it means like awful or terrible. So yeah, Derrida kind of like argues that like language is like this thing that flows and can be translated into different meanings.
So what's the difference between, or like the relationship, if there's any, between uh deconstructionalism and post-structuralism?
And pardon?
Oh, and post-structuralism.
I have no idea what post-structuralism actually like the
Oh,
definition of it means.
okay. I have no idea either, but okay.
Okay.
So, well then, let's talk about the difference between gender and race. So, um,
Okay.
what is race? Like, how do you define race? Yeah, how do you define race?
Honestly, I think it's very like it's very self-grandizing in a way to say that I can define race, because gender is something that like would affect everyone. But with and obviously with gender, there's significantly less sides to the spectrum. There's like biologically speaking, there's like men and women, I guess, in a sense. But for race, it's a lot more difficult because there are so many different aspects of it that I'm not sure I can like successfully put it. I will say though that race is like mm, race as a biological term is really like more well defined than gender. Um, and race, because I haven't never heard of someone that is like socially acceptable to be transracial other than like that one person on Dr. Phil. So I will say that. However, I do think that like the negative connotations with race are very similar to gender, like the different stereotypes and the prejudices. They're very similar to how we see gender norms and gender prejudices.
Okay. So why doesn't society accept transracial people like when they accept transgender?
Honestly, like why they don't accept transracial people? Honestly, I think it's just because like
Yeah.
it's definitely more of a jarring thing, and it's in a way sort of like so like on Dr. Phil, the person who like claim like they claim they're like transracial or something, and they claim they're white even though they were black. And I think to at some point it's seen as like a sort of disrespect, because race carries like different races carries like different cultures and that kind of things. So when you're saying that like I identified like to become a white person, it sort of seems kind of ignorant of all the past histories of that specific race, just to like be like, oh, I'm like a white person or something. Especially when it's like, you sort of become the oppressor in that sense, and you're like, because I remember the woman on Dr. Phil, she was like, I am not a black person because I don't like fried chicken, and I don't like steel or something like that. It was something really weird, and it was something that like it was something really odd, and I think that that was why people didn't accept that. Is because like, well, what are you doing? Because you're not a stereotype, you're not that thing. That's like not how it works.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, but I mean, gender also carries with it some how do you say I guess culture, or well, not that much as race, but still, like, why could somebody identify as transgender but not transracial? Like, well, I mean, I feel like what it means to identify as like a trans person is to a transgender person is to say that you feel the experience of a man, right? But
Hmm.
so do you think it is like possible to like authentically feel the experience of another race, a person of another race?
I think our society has like there's a bunch of different like different cultures in there that it feels that like transracial people in a sense feel a lot more like willfully ignorant than like transgender people. I can't really speak on behalf of transracial or perhaps sorry, transgender or perhaps transracial people, but I will say there's a different like kind of societal divide based on the fact that like race seems to be something that's so much more ingrained in our culture because gender like gender norms also fall the fact because of marketing and things like the shaving thing or whatever, and they fall because of like for example Engels argues that like the original like divide between men and women was because people viewed women as objects, as like commodities, but for races it's something that's so much more ingrained in our politics and our history that it seems sort of impossible to put your own identity away from like your culture or whatever. And that's why like I guess in a sense like maybe whitewashing has become like a lot more apparent. Like I think for me, I'm pretty whitewashed. I'm like I live in Canada and stuff, and my mom's like Chinese, so I am pretty whitewashed. But I wouldn't go so far to say that I feel the experience of a white person. You know, like it's just I think it's different culturally and historically.
Right. Okay. Well, do you think being a feminist sort of implies supporting affirmative action for women, or is it just like
Supporting pardon.
is it just describing like an end?
Can you repeat the first part? Like, it doesn't mean supporting the something of woman.
Oh, yeah. So does being a feminist imply being um supporting affirmative action for women, or does it simply imply um having the end of gender equality?
I think feminism as a term varies greatly throughout different people and what it means to them. For me personally, I think I would advocate more for gender equality. Um, yeah, I think a lot of people think, especially in the current day and age, that feminists are all these like kill all men type of creatures that like believe that women should be superior to men and that women should like be the best or whatever. I don't agree with that. I think that's like those type of feminists are what created the ideal of like the bad liberal feminists in the first place. I think instead, feminism should push towards equality. And something that Roxane Gay said in her book Bad Feminist was something about how like even if another woman is not a feminist, she'll continue like the fight for equality on their behalf. And I really like that idea because of like the for example the Me Too movement, there's been a big push for other women that they need to become feminists. Like if you're not a feminist and if you don't say you're a feminist, you actually are supporting misogyny. I don't agree with that. I agree with Roxane Gay in the sense that like even if other women don't want to put the label on themselves to be feminist, it's like it's okay. It's like totally understandable because there's a lot of like pejorative context that comes with saying you're a feminist. Instead, like, um, that's fine. And then I'll help like advocate the right for equality on their behalf. It doesn't have to be like, um, you're either for women, you're either with us or against us, that kind of thing. You know, it's like we're just all trying to like help each other and then like help achieve gender equality.
Okay. Uh, Wait. So somebody made the argument that if you don't identify as a feminist, you are contributing to misogyny.
Yeah, people actually identify. People kind of like they don't. It's not really identifying with the argument. It's rather sort of just being um, like with the Me Too movement, it's like I stood up, I spoke my story. So when are you gonna tell your story? When are you gonna talk about how you're a victim of the patriarchy too? It's been like a pressure of a sense to be like, um, if all women are oppressed, we all need to start speaking out about it so we can all like come together. And even though like there is somewhat of a good sentiment there, right? There is somewhat of like, oh yeah, we've got to band together and empower each other. There's also sort of a pressure there too, because it's like we don't want to force people to like tell their stories and constantly speak about like how they're oppressed. If they're not comfortable with it, then like so be it. They don't we're not trying to force it upon them.
So what do you think are the individual responsibilities under sort of systemic oppression? Like, do you think that, like, for example, well, let's just imagine this sort of like hypothetical like thought experiment. Like, so if there is, a very powerful person who like
Mm-hmm.
points a gun to another person's head and says like, if you don't like put some other person at gunpoint, that is like to put your gun like on the head of some other people and like um threaten them to do the same. um I mean, that is sort of a systemic oppression, right? So if there's this person who oppresses this person who oppresses this person, like by pointing guns. So, and if the oppressed does not sort of put another person at gunpoint, he'll be shot. Let's just put it that way. He'll be shot. Um, so do you think there is a responsibility for the individual to not put another person at gunpoint?
I think that when someone points a gun at you, your only options aren't just point another gun or get shot. There's like 102 other things you can do. Like, and that's like a quote from the show Suits. Um, but yeah, I definitely think that the idea of systemic oppression and the idea that you can't do anything is a little bit like weird because you definitely can do stuff about it. And like systemic oppression doesn't have to deal with like people on a hierarchy specifically pointing guns at each other. It's more to deal with like the system and of itself is flawed. If you're in like America and you don't have money to access healthcare, the system is already against you because they're not helping you. That's in a way that's systemic oppression. It's the way the system is built that always like throws like obstacles at you that won't be there if you were like richer or if you were white or if you were a man. That's like I think for systemic oppression it's more to deal with the fact that the system's already rigged against you and finding ways to acknowledge that and finding ways to hold like the government and the system accountable is what's more important in that case.
Right. So if I don't rebel against the system, am I contributing to the oppression of some other person?
Honestly, I think the most important fact is like educating yourself because although there is the idea that's like a bystander is just as bad as the perpetrator, that's only true if it's like something like you're seeing a gross injustice that's being carried out right in front of your eyes, like the things that are happening in Gaza right now. If you like stand idly by and you don't make your voice heard, then in some way it is contributing because you're kind of falling into the system of things. You're falling into the system of like objects that is like that relies on you not speaking your voice. But I do agree that for a lot of people, it's like not viable to be like a big activist because of like what they prefer or something or if harm comes to them because it's not like I guess it's not like easy to be like always speaking out against things because it does put you at great risk too. I think there has to be some sort of like balance probably, because like yeah, I don't know, this is a tough question, but I do think that like the responsibility that we hold to ourselves and to society isn't really like completely clear cut.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that sort of wraps up my questions. Do you have any things you want to discuss?
I mean, I'm good. I would like to know that, like, do you have it, like, what were your thoughts? Like, do you think you agreed with me at some point? Do you think you disagreed? How did you feel?
I mean, I felt fine. I probably agree with like everything you said. Like yeah, because I'm not really good at thinking like on the spot. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay. I mean, thank you. It was like
yeah. Thank
really
you.
like thought provoking, the questions that you asked.
Well, I'm glad that it's so. Okay, well then I'll see you. I don't know. I'll see you somewhere. I guess maybe.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you. See you.